Roberts.
Well, Mr. Speaker, here we are, under urgency, debating the government's budget, the critical measures to turbocharge the economy, to take the step up, to lift wages, to get better jobs. And the government comes to the House to remove cheque duty. That's right. Stop the marches in the street, call off the hunger strikes, cheque duty is gone. Around the country, New Zealanders celebrate the fact that they will save, on average, 35 cents a year. 35 cents a year saved by the removal of cheque duty. I've got advice for New Zealanders around the country. Don't spend it all in one shop. That's my advice. 35 cents a year. This is the government's big idea that holds us here in urgency on a Friday, the removal of cheque duty. We're looking in the budget, we're looking for the comparable measures. The rebate on cassette players, fondue sets and lava lamps. Because that's about as relevant as cheque duty is to the economy today. Trevor Mallard may also have a rebate placed on him by the end of the day. Mr. Speaker, this is as good as it gets from the government. This is the thing that they've lifted out from the budget to say, here's our economic plan, the removal of cheque duty. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's not enough. It's hard to believe that the government thought it was important enough for Bill English, in the middle of all of the many initiatives he could have talked about in his budget speech, he chose to talk about the removal of cheque duty. So, Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we welcome the scourge of cheque duty being taken away from the lives of New Zealanders. But we ask ourselves whether or not a timid, scattered, backward-looking, fragmented budget like this deserves to have cheque duty lifted out as the biggie. But that 35 cents a year, by the way, those figures do come from the Bankers Association, an average of 7 cheques a year written out by bank consumers around New Zealand. Goodness only knows some people must be writing a lot of cheques to get that average up. But 7 cheques a year, 5 cents a cheque, 35 cents a year, delivering to New Zealanders. This is the social dividend from the national government. 35 cents a year. Amazing stuff. Do they still have 35-cent mixtures? They probably did in the 1980s when people were paying by cheque, but they don't anymore. 35 cents a year from the government to turbocharge the economy. I was seeking advice from Mr. Mallard on the future of 35-cent mixtures. Oh, yes. Not anymore. Mr. Speaker, that's the first part of this bill, so there's the turbocharging of the economy. Then we come to the measures to relieve the housing crisis. The government's decided that they recognise the depth of the housing crisis, the fact that in Auckland particularly housing is becoming unaffordable. Last month, $6,000 was added to the cost of an average house in Auckland. And so the government's come along today with a package of measures to sort out the devil of the cost of plasterboard and varnish and nails in the construction of houses. They've guessed that it will save $3,500. The Minister actually basically just said that. It's just a guess of approximately $3,500. Well, that might touch the conveyancing fee for somebody trying to buy a house. And just while we're at it, first home buyers and building houses don't always go together. Just a hint for the government that if they want to actually do something that will improve first home buyers, they need to have a program like KiwiBuild, where we're actually going to build 100,000 affordable homes across New Zealand. But, Mr. Speaker, we will, and my colleague Phil Twyford will certainly be speaking at some length in this debate around Part 3 of the bill and how it's a woefully inadequate response to the housing crisis. But I do note that within the budget and housing, Mr. Speaker, a number of interesting facts have come to light. And this is that at the moment, many people are struggling to buy a house, struggling to service a mortgage, and you need to spend at the moment in New Zealand 49% of the average gross full-time wage to service a standard mortgage. That's tough work for people, 49%. Well, what the budget shows us is that by 2018-2019, it'll be 63% of the average gross full-time wage to service a standard mortgage. 63%. But it gets worse, Mr. Speaker. If you're in Auckland, 49% now, 63% average across New Zealand. If you're in Auckland, 83% of the average gross full-time wage to service a standard mortgage. That's why housing is unaffordable for New Zealand. That's the Kiwi dream being taken away from the next generation of New Zealanders. We have a housing crisis in New Zealand. We all have a responsibility to do something about it. And in this legislation, the national government's taking the tariff off nails and varnish and plasterboard. It's not enough. It's insufficient. It's hopeless. It will not do anything to greatly improve the chances of people getting into their first homes. And that's it for housing in this budget. That is it. The third part of the bill, Mr. Speaker, is that around the Climate Change Response Act, and my colleague Moana Maki will have more to say about that. What we can say there, though, is that while it's been described by the Minister as an unintended consequence, that's not how it's viewed out in the sector. And the question we have on this side of the House is, why does the government hate the forestry sector so much? Why has the government got it in for the forestry sector to take them on? And I can tell the government this, having looked at the regulatory impact statement, the section where they say there has been no consultation with stakeholders on this, that was a mistake. Can I just say that was a mistake? Right around the country, iwi forest owners are not going to be happy with this. They're not going to be happy with this response. This is not the climate change legislation, quite clearly, that the government should be putting before the House. So, Mr. Speaker, that's it. That's what the government's come to us with today as their big budget bill to bring in front of the House under urgency. It is woefully inadequate, Mr. Speaker. We look to this budget for some ambition for the New Zealand economy, and it's not there. It's politics as usual. It's an election year budget where they come in and stolen a few policies from Labor, but it leaves ambition for the economy at the door. If we want to have good wages, if we want to have good jobs, higher wages, it doesn't come from tweaks to the check duty. It comes from actually adopting an approach where we bring New Zealanders together, a partnership between the government and business and communities about creating jobs, about making sure that there's industry and regional development, that there's an economic upgrade that will actually add value. We're not going to get higher wages in New Zealand by politics as usual, by investing in the same things we've always have done at the same rate. We need to upgrade the economy in manufacturing, in forestry, in ICT. We need to make sure that the skills are being gained by people to take on those jobs. We need to get the settings of the economy right by changing monetary policy so that people are back at the centre of the economy, not the speculators, not the bankers, but the people who actually drive productivity in our economy. And that's the other thing that's missing from this budget, Mr. Speaker. Where is the dividend to reduce inequality? If we really want to do something in our economy and our society, then we have to harness the talents of all New Zealanders. And this budget leaves behind those who live in poverty. There is very little in this budget that reaches those people, and the last bill we debated missed them out entirely, Mr. Speaker. This is not a budget for future generations. This is a budget for this election year. If this was a budget for future generations, we wouldn't be allowing superannuation spending to outstrip education spending this year. And that's what's happening. There is no policy in here for future generations to know they will have universal superannuation. There's nothing here that looks ahead to that. There's nothing here that looks ahead to safeguarding the Kiwi dream of home ownership, of giving people a fair chance to get on the property ladder. There's nothing in here to address the inequality that means if you're lucky enough to live in Mission Bay in Auckland, your median income will have gone up by $6,000 over the last few years. But if you're in Mangere or Otahuhu, you'll end up with only a $200 increase. That kind of inequality cannot be sustained in our economy. Mr. Speaker, this is a woefully inadequate piece of legislation that the government thinks somehow trumpets their budget. It actually shows their budget is a failure.
The Honourable Simon Bridges.
Granted that Mr Robertson couldn't purchase enough wine gums for his calorific outtake of that speech from a sole check on check